on a freezing night behind her diner. A single mom handed a homeless man a warm meal. Weeks later, his lawyers knocked on her door. At 35, she moved through her days with the quiet endurance of someone who couldn't afford to fall apart. Double shifts at the diner. A tired smile for customers. A small apartment where her daughter waited with homework on the table, and too many questions Clara didn't always have the energy to answer. Her kindness wasn't loud. It was rationed, carefully measured in a life where even compassion had a cost. And the man she would feed? He was just a stranger at first. A presence at the edge of her routine. Someone she would notice before she ever knew his name. Their lives were never meant to intersect. But sometimes, the smallest acts of mercy bend the path of two broken people toward a future neither could imagine. Before this story continues, if you believe small kindness can change lives in ways we never see coming, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The night Clara Huffman first noticed him, the cold had a way of sinking into your bones. The kind that made your breath sting and your fingers ache even inside your pockets. She stood alone behind the diner's back door, keys heavy in her hand, shoulders tight from another double shift that had stretched her patience thinner than her paycheck. Inside, the lights were already off. The smell of grease still clung to her clothes. Her feet throbbed with the dull, familiar pain of someone who spent her life standing for other people's comfort. Clara didn't count her life in years. She counted it in hours worked, in bills paid late, but paid. At night she promised her daughter she'd be home before bedtime, and failed. She glanced down at the folded list in her pocket before she could stop herself. Rent, electric, bus fare, new pencils for school. Numbers that never seemed to shrink no matter how carefully she planned them. As she locked up, her eyes drifted to the edge of the sidewalk. That's when she saw him. He wasn't begging. He wasn't knocking on the glass. He wasn't even looking at her. The man sat on the curb beneath the diner's dim backlight, shoulders hunched, hands folded together like he was trying to hold on to warmth that wasn't there. His jacket was too thin for the weather. His shoes were worn down at the heels. He stared through the window at the darkened kitchen, not with desperation, but with a quiet, practiced hunger. The kind that comes from learning not to ask. For a moment, Clara told herself to walk past. She had groceries to stretch, homework waiting on the kitchen table, a bus to catch before the last one of the night left her stranded. She had no extra anything. But something about the way the man kept his eyes lowered, like he was ashamed of being seen wanting, made her pause. She thought about the plate of food still warm inside, the one no one had claimed, the one she'd been saving to take home, just in case her daughter was still awake and hungry. Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening around her keys. Then she went back inside. When she returned, the man flinched at first, as if expecting to be told to move along. Instead, she placed the paper bag gently beside him. "I had extra," she said, already turning away. Not wanting thanks. Not wanting eye contact. Not wanting to make it heavier than it needed to be. The man stared at the bag like it might disappear if he reached for it too quickly. Then, softly, almost embarrassed by the sound of his own voice, he said, "Thank you." Clara didn't answer. She walked toward the streetlight, heart beating faster than it should have over something so small. It was just one meal, just one moment. But neither of them knew yet that this small kindness would become a hinge in both their lives. The quiet turning point between who they were and who they were about to become. The next night, Clara didn't expect to see him again. Kindness, in her experience, was usually a one-time thing. A moment people gave away and then tucked behind them like spare change. She stepped out into the cold with her jacket pulled tight, already bracing herself for the long walk to the bus stop, when she noticed the familiar shape near the curb. He was sitting in the same place, not waiting, not watching the door, just there. For a second, Clara felt something like relief, and then scolded herself for it. She didn't know him. She didn't know him anything. And yet, her eyes went instinctively to the back door, to the sliver of warm light still bleeding from the kitchen. There was no extra plate this time. She told herself that was the end of it. She nodded to him in passing, a small, almost embarrassed gesture, and kept walking. The wind cut across her face, and she tucked her chin into her scarf. Halfway to the bus stop, she stopped. She stood there, feeling the weight of her empty hands. The image of her daughter at the kitchen table came to her, pencil between her teeth, waiting. The image of the man's eyes came too, not pleading, not accusing. Just there. Clara turned back. Inside, the kitchen was quiet. The cook had already wiped down the grill. The night manager was counting the till. Clara opened her locker and stared at the small container she'd packed for herself. Rice, beans, the last of the chicken from yesterday's shift. It wasn't much. It was supposed to last her until morning. She closed the locker, then opened it again. When she stepped back outside, she didn't sit with him. She didn't ask his recall. She set the container down on the edge of the curb like someone leaving a gift for a cat that might or might not come out of hiding. I didn't touch it, she said, too quickly. As if that mattered. He hesitated before reaching for it, his fingers hovering in the cold air. Thank you, he said again. The words sounded different this time. Less startled. More careful. They didn't talk after that. Clara walked away, stomach hollow, heart heavier than it had been a minute before. On the bus ride home, she pressed her palm against the glass and told herself it was fine. She'd eaten at work. She could manage. She always did. The third night, she brought him a sandwich wrapped in paper. The fourth, a cup of soup she had poured into a disposable cup. The fifth, half a pie that would have been thrown away. It never became a big thing. No speeches. No promises. Just the quiet exchange of something warm into hands that shook less each night. They began to talk in pieces. Not stories. Not names. Just fragments. Cold tonight, Clara said once, handing him a cup. He nodded. Winter doesn't ask permission. It made her look at him twice. Another night, she asked if he needed socks. She had an extra pair in her bag, meant for her daughter's gym class the next day. He shook his head too quickly, embarrassment coloring his face. I'm all right, he said. And then, as if correcting himself, I mean, thank you. Really. He spoke carefully, not like someone who hadn't spoken to people in a long time. More like someone who was choosing each word. Clara noticed things she didn't mean to notice. The way he folded the paper neatly before setting it aside. The way he washed his hands with melted snow from a bottle before touching the food. The way he looked away when she watched him eat. Shame sat on him heavier than the cold. One night, when the rain came down on thin needles, she brought him a plastic poncho from the lost and found bin inside the diner. He held it like it was something fragile. I lost everything, he said suddenly, not meeting her eyes. Clara stilled. She hadn't asked. Everything, she echoed quietly. He nodded once. Family. Work. A life that made sense. He paused, then added, it happens faster than people think. She wanted to ask how. She wanted to ask who. She didn't. Instead, she said, I'm sorry. He gave a small, crooked smile. People always say that. The rain kept falling. The city hummed around them, loud and indifferent. Clara stood there longer than she meant to, the cold biting through her shoes. Over the next weeks, the routine settled in. Some nights, she had something to give. Some nights, she only had a few words. Sometimes he wasn't there, and she felt a strange, unreasonable worry tug at her chest. Sometimes he was there and didn't take the food right away, like he was trying to remind himself he hadn't imagined her kindness into existence. She learned what days he stayed quiet. He learned when her eyes looked tired in a way sleep wouldn't fix. The cost crept in quietly. Clara skipped meals she told herself she didn't need. She walked home instead of taking the bus when her money ran thin. She stretched groceries thinner than they were meant to go. Her daughter noticed. You're not eating, she said one night, pushing her plate across the table. I ate at work, Clara lied, and hated how easy it came. The man noticed too. You don't have to do this, he said once, voice low, eyes fixed on the pavement. I know, Clara answered. But she did it anyway. Because something about him made her remember the version of herself she had been when she first found out she was alone in the world. The version that hadn't asked for help because she didn't know how to carry the weight of owing anyone anything. Some nights, they stood in silence. Some nights, he said things that sounded like confessions without details. I trusted the wrong people, he told her once. Another time, it's strange how fast dignity becomes optional. Once, in a softer voice, I used to be someone. Clara never asked who. She told him about her daughter instead. About the way she slept with one sock on and one off. About the drawings taped to the fridge. About the questions she asked that Clara didn't always know how to answer. He listened like it mattered. One night, as Clara turned to leave, she felt something shift inside her. The routine that had started as a simple act of decency had begun to shape her evenings. Her steps slowed when she knew he might be there. Her pockets felt heavier with the weight of what she might give. Kindness was no longer just something she did. It was something she expected of herself. As she walked toward the bus stop, the cold pressing into her back, Clara realized with a quiet, unsettling clarity. This wasn't just about feeding a stranger anymore. It was about how her heart was learning to wait for him. The nights grew colder, and the space between Clara's shifts and her walk home felt longer. She learned the back door's timing by heart. The minute when the kitchen lights dimmed and the manager's footsteps faded toward the front. That was when she slipped whatever she could into a paper bag. Sometimes it was a full plate. Sometimes it was just bread and the last scoop of soup. Once, it was nothing more than 2 bruised apples she'd rescued from the bin. No one saw her. No one thanked her. That was the point. She told herself it mattered that no one else was watching. That kindness, when it had an audience, started to feel like a performance. What she did for him lived in the quiet space behind the diner, where the city's noise thinned into the sound of distant traffic and the rattle of a loose sign in the wind. He waited most nights, not always in the same place. Sometimes tucked closer to the wall when the rain came. Sometimes standing, pacing as if movement could keep the cold from finding him. He never asked when she'd come out. He never asked what she'd bring. Didn't want anyone thinking you were stealing, he said once, nodding at the bag in her hand. I'm not, Clara replied. It was going to get thrown away. He studied her face, then nodded, accepting the story she needed to tell herself. They sat a little closer now. Not close enough to touch. Close enough to share warmth when the wind cut through the alley. One night, as he ate, he said, I trusted someone who knew exactly where to cut. Clara didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the wet pavement. People don't usually ruin you by accident. He let out a breath that sounded like a laugh that didn't find its way out. No, they don't. She wanted to ask who. She wanted to ask why. Instead, she said, I trusted someone once too. The word surprised her. She hadn't meant to offer them. They slipped out anyway, soft and unfinished. He glanced at her, careful. Once is enough. It was. She thought of the man who had promised to stay, who had promised to help raise the daughter he'd helped create, who had disappeared the moment responsibility stopped being theoretical. She thought of the nights she had waited for a text that never came. The way trust, once broken, left a bruise that didn't show on the skin. I learned not to expect people to stay, Clara said. He nodded, slow. I learned not to expect people to tell the truth. They shared the silence that followed. Not awkward, just heavy with things that didn't need to be named to be understood. The cost of her quiet mercy began to stack up. She counted coins at the grocery store and put back what she couldn't afford. She took the long way home when the bus fare tipped past what she could spare. She told herself she wasn't hungry, even when her stomach argued otherwise. Some nights, her daughter fell asleep waiting for her. Clara stood in the doorway and watched the slow rise and fall of her chest, guilt pressing into her ribs. She wondered how long kindness could stretch before it tore something in her own life. Behind the diner, the man's guard slipped in small, careful ways. He told her he'd once worn suits that fit too well, that he used to hate being late, that he'd had a kitchen with more light than he knew what to do with. You miss it? Clara asked. He shrugged. I miss who I was when I believed I deserved it. The word sat with her long after she left him with his food. One night, the wind howled through the alley so hard it rattled the back door. Clara's fingers were numb as she set the bag down. When she straightened, she saw his shoulders shaking. Not from the cold. He had his face turned away, but the sound gave him away, a quiet, contained breaking, like something inside him had finally found a crack. Clara froze. She didn't reach for him. She didn't offer words she didn't know would help. She stood there, close enough that he would know she hadn't left. After a long moment, he wiped his face with the sleeve of his jacket. Sorry, he said, voice rough. It gets loud in my head at night. You don't have to be sorry, Clara replied. I do, he said, for needing anything at all. The words hurt to hear. She thought of all the times she had swallowed her own need. Of the way pride could dress itself up as strength until it left you alone with your hunger. You're allowed to need, she said, more firmly than she felt. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something like gratitude crossed his face. Not for the food, but for the permission. When Clara walked away that night, her chest felt tight in a way the cold couldn't explain. She knew she was stepping closer to something she had promised herself she wouldn't let grow. Attachment. Hope. The dangerous belief that people could matter without leaving scars behind. As she reached the corner, She glanced back at the alley, at the small figure hunched beneath the light. She wondered, with an ache she didn't have words for yet, who he had been, before the world taught him how to disappear. The night he didn't show, the alley felt wrong before Clara even reached the back door. The cold was sharper than usual, needling through the thin fabric of her jacket. Rain whispered against the metal bins, and the single bulb above the door flickered, casting the alley in uneven light. Clara stepped out with the paper bag warm against her palm, the smell of soup threading through the damp air. He wasn't there. At first, she told herself he was late. Maybe he'd gone to the corner to warm his hands at the vent that breathed out steam from the laundromat. Maybe he'd stepped into the shadows to avoid the wind. She waited, shifting her weight from one aching foot to the other, listening for the soft scuff of shoes she had come to recognize. Nothing. The space where he usually stood felt larger without him, as if the alley itself had stretched in his absence. Clara's eyes traced the wall, the curb, the place he leaned when the wind got loud. The cold settled into her bones, but she didn't move. She left the bag on the ground where he would see it. It was a small hope, a quiet offering to the night. On the walk home, she kept turning around, half expecting to see his shape emerge from the dark, embarrassed for being late, apologetic for nothing. The streetlights hummed. Cars hissed past. The city went on, indifferent to the small vacancy she carried with her. He wasn't there the next night either. Clara came out with bread wrapped in napkins and the last of the soup. The bag felt heavier this time, as if it carried more than food. She stood longer than she should have, eyes searching the alley like it might give up an answer if she stared hard enough. By the third night, the worry found its way into her chest. She walked past the alley's mouth and peered down the block. Nothing. She checked the side street where he sometimes waited when the wind cut too hard. The door of the shelter 3 streets over was closed, the windows dark. She stood there longer than she meant to, the paper bag growing cold in her hand, until the night watchman cleared his throat and looked at her with questions he didn't ask. On the bus ride home, Clara's thoughts tangled. Maybe he'd found somewhere warmer. Maybe he'd finally taken a bed at a shelter. Maybe someone else had noticed him. The maybe that pressed hardest was the one she tried not to think. Maybe something had happened. She saw him in small places he wasn't. A hunched figure near the bus stop. A shadow by the fence. Each time, her heart lifted and fell again, the rhythm leaving her tired in a way sleep couldn't touch. Days passed. The space behind the diner grew familiar in a new, hollow way. The light flickered. The bins rattled. The place he used to stand gathered dust. Clara brought food anyway. She set the bag down, waited a minute, then took it with her when no one came. The guilt crept in quietly. It told her she should have asked more questions, that she should have pushed him to take help she couldn't offer. That kindness, when it stayed small, sometimes felt like neglect in disguise. At home, her daughter asked why she looked sad. "I'm just tired," Clara said, and hated how easy the lie felt. She thought of the night he'd said it got loud in his head. She wondered where he went when it got too loud to stay. One evening, she walked further than she ever had, past the shelters she knew by name, past the church that handed out soup on Tuesdays. She scanned faces without meaning to, learning how quickly you could look at a person and not really see them. How the city trained you to move on. The realization made her throat tight. She stood at the edge of the block, the cold crawling up her legs, and understood that absence could bruise as deeply as presence could heal. That when someone vanished, they took the small routines with them. The shared quiet, the unasked questions, the fragile comfort of knowing where to stand at night. Clara turned back toward home, the alley behind the diner receding into darkness. She carried the space he left with her. And in that empty space, something new took root, a wound shaped like waiting. The knock came on a Sunday morning, the kind of quiet morning that made every sound feel too loud. Clara was standing at the sink, rinsing a single plate, counting the minutes until she'd have to wake her daughter for school the next day. The apartment was small enough that the hum of the refrigerator filled the room. Outside, the city was taking a slow breath between nights. The knock startled her. 2 sharp raps. Then another. Her first thought was that she'd done something wrong. The second was that something had happened. She dried her hands on the edge of her sweater and moved toward the door, each step careful, as if the floor might give way beneath her. When she opened it, 2 men stood in the narrow hallway, their coats cut clean, their shoes too polished for the building. One held a leather folder against his chest. The other wore a look that belonged in offices with glass walls. Clara Huffman? The taller one asked. Her name in his mouth felt strange. She nodded, already bracing for a problem she didn't understand. We're here on behalf of Mr. Daniel Hart, the other said gently, as if gentleness could soften whatever came next. May we come in? The name meant nothing to her. It sounded like a name you'd pass on the street and forget. Clara glanced back at her daughter's closed bedroom door, then stepped aside. They took in the room with careful eyes, the narrow couch, the stack of unopened mail, the chipped table with one unsteady leg. Not judgmental, just noting. Clara folded her arms, suddenly aware of the thinness of her sweater. If this is about rent, I paid it, she said, too quickly. One of the men smiled in a way that wasn't unkind. This isn't about rent. The word didn't calm her. They introduced themselves. Lawyers, they said, from a firm whose name slid past her like water over glass. Clara waited for the sentence to finish, for the accusation to land. Her mind filled the space with small panics. A paperwork error, a missed form, a mistake she didn't know she'd made. We're trying to locate someone, the taller man said. A man you've been in contact with. The room tilted, just a little. Her breath caught. I don't, she stopped. The image of the alley rose unbidden. The paper bag in her hand. The quiet thank you he'd offered like it cost him something. I haven't seen him in weeks, she said. They exchanged a look. The kind that meant the truth was about to change shape. The man you knew as well, the man outside the diner. The lawyer said, choosing his words carefully, is not who you think he is. Clara's pulse found her ears. He's homeless, she said, even as the word felt thin in her mouth. He was, the other man corrected. For a time. They told her then that the man she'd fed in the cold had another name. A longer one. One that appeared in articles she didn't read and lawsuits she'd never heard of. They said he was the estranged heir to a family whose name moved markets. That he'd vanished after a legal betrayal that stripped him of access, reputation, and safety. That the scandal had burned bright and fast, leaving him without a place to stand. When he disappeared, people went looking for him, but not in alleys behind diners. Clara sat down without realizing she'd moved. The words didn't fit the man she knew. She saw him as he was to her, careful with his hands, as if afraid of taking too much space. The way he straightened his jacket before accepting food, like dignity, was a habit he refused to break. The way he spoke, measured and polite, his sentences shaped like someone who used to belong to rooms that expected him to choose words well. She'd noticed that, even then. The way his thank you sounded practiced. The way he kept his shoes clean with water from the sink when no one was looking. She had noticed, and told herself it meant nothing. Why me? She asked, the question small and unsteady. He told us about you, one of the lawyers said. About the meals. About the nights you didn't ask questions. About the way you made it possible for him to keep going. Clara shook her head. I just brought him food. The lawyer met her eyes. Sometimes that's the difference between staying and disappearing. They explained that he had been found. That the family he'd fled had finally reached him through a chain of quiet connections. That he was safe now, recovering in a place Clara would never see, surrounded by people who used words like resources and arrangements when they meant power. He asked us to find you, the taller man said. To thank you. The room felt suddenly too small for the truth it held. Clara pressed her palms into her knees, grounding herself in the chipped wood beneath her fingers. The broken man she knew, the one who flinched at loud sounds, who apologized for needing warmth, didn't match the air they described. The two versions of him wouldn't settle into one shape in her mind. They stood apart, like reflections in different windows. I didn't do anything special, she said, because saying otherwise felt like taking credit for something she didn't understand. The lawyers didn't argue. They didn't need to. They stood to leave, their presence already receding into the hallway. At the door, one of them turned back. He wanted you to know, he said, that what you did mattered. When the door closed, the quiet rushed back in, louder than before. Clara stood alone in her small apartment, the air still holding the imprint of words that didn't belong there. Outside, the city moved as it always had. Inside, something had shifted. The alley behind the diner felt suddenly connected to rooms she'd never enter, to names she'd never speak aloud. She leaned her forehead against the door, letting the cool wood steady her breath. The world she never touched had just knocked on her door. Clara's hands shook as she pushed open the door. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and old wood, the kind that holds 100 quiet memories. He was there, sitting by the window, slouched in a chair that seemed too big for him. When he turned, the weight in his eyes, the emptiness she had imagined, was pierced by recognition. Clara. His voice was hoarse, brittle, yet there was warmth hidden in it, fragile as spun glass. She swallowed, the lump in her throat heavy, and took a step forward. I brought you food, she stammered, though she knew words were useless. He smiled, a small curve that held a lifetime of gratitude. I know, he said simply. You saved me. The words landed like stones. She remembered the nights she had wandered, carrying scraps of bread, whispering to the shadows, unsure if anyone even lived to hear her voice. And yet, here he was, alive. I don't know what to say, Clara admitted. Say nothing, he said. His hand trembled as he reached for hers, and for the first time, she let herself feel the weight of relief, of victory so quiet it almost hurt. Your kindness kept me alive. Her chest tightened. She had never imagined that her quiet, unseen efforts could mean something so monumental to someone. And yet, hearing it, she felt exposed, like a secret she had carried alone had finally been acknowledged. The door creaked, and 2 men in crisp suits entered. Lawyers, she guessed, their eyes measuring everything. Papers rustled in their hands, a sharp contrast to the soft weight of the moment she shared with him. We've come with an offer, one said. His tone was businesslike, unfeeling. His family wishes to compensate you for your role in his survival. It's substantial. Clara froze. Money. Offers. Transactions. She had expected this, feared it, even, but the reality felt like a cold hand pressing against her spine. I don't want anything, she said before she could stop herself. The man beside her frowned. Clara, it's not charity. They're trying to make amends. She shook her head. I didn't help you for money. Her voice was sharper than she meant, but the tension in her chest needed release. I helped because I had to, because if I didn't, I'd have lost myself. He leaned closer, eyes searching hers. You don't have to refuse. Accepting kindness doesn't make you weak. The words struck her deeper than she expected. Weak. Brave. 2 sides of a coin she'd spent years flipping, never sure which would land. You think I'm brave? She whispered, almost to herself. I do, he said firmly. Because it takes courage to let someone in, to allow yourself to be helped, even if you think you don't deserve it. Clara felt tears sting the corners of her eyes. She had spent so long hiding, so long protecting herself from disappointment and betrayal, that the idea of receiving something, anything, felt foreign, even dangerous. Yet here it was, offered without pretense, without judgment. The lawyers shifted impatiently, their suits rustling like dry leaves. Clara looked at him again. He was no longer just a figure she had fed. He was real, fragile, and undeniably human. And he needed her, even if only in the quiet acknowledgement of her presence. I suppose I could consider it, she said softly, surprising herself. Not for me, but because you deserve it. And maybe because I need to accept that sometimes kindness isn't a weakness. His smile was quiet, but it held the depth of the oceans. You've been giving without asking for anything in return. Let this be the first time you allow yourself to receive. For a long moment, Clara just breathed. The room seemed to settle around them, the sharp lines of the lawyers and the sterile walls fading into the background. She could feel the shift inside herself, the loosening of a grip she hadn't realized she'd held so tightly. You saved me, he said again, softer now, almost a whisper. But in doing so, you saved yourself too. Clara blinked, overwhelmed by the simplicity of it, the truth she had resisted seeing. Maybe bravery wasn't in solitary strength. Maybe bravery was in the courage to accept that someone else could walk beside you, even for a moment, without judgment. I understand, she whispered, her voice trembling. I think I'm ready to let that in. And as she finally reached out, letting his hand close around hers, she realized that kindness, both given and received, wasn't a burden. It was the quiet pulse of life that could keep even the most broken parts of a person alive. The lawyers cleared their throats, shifting the moment back into the practical world. But Clara didn't flinch. She had chosen, in that fragile, tender instant, to be brave, to accept not because it was easy, but because it was right. And in doing so, she felt, perhaps for the first time, entirely whole. Clara sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the quiet room bathed in pale morning light. The letter from the lawyers lay folded on the table beside her, a neat rectangle of ink and promise. She traced its edges with her fingertip, her mind tugging in 1,000 directions. Pride, she realized, had been her constant companion. It had been both shield and cage, keeping her safe from disappointment, but also keeping her from breathing freely. She had fought to do everything on her own, carrying the weight of survival as if it were a medal to prove her worth. But now, holding the fragile paper in her hand, she wondered, could accepting help be brave too? Her thoughts drifted immediately to her daughter, the small bright spark of hope who had always given her reason to rise, even on the days when the world felt too heavy. If she could accept kindness, not as a gift she owed, but as a bridge to something better for the both of them, wouldn't that be strength rather than weakness? Clara's hand hovered over the phone, hesitating. She wanted to reach him, not the lawyers, not the offers, but him, the man she had fed, the man who had survived because she had dared to care. She wanted to tell him she was ready, on her own terms, to accept what was being offered, not as surrender, but as acknowledgement of the life they had shared, however briefly. When he arrived, there was no fanfare, no applause, no dramatic revelation, just the soft creak of the door and the familiar weight of his presence. His eyes held the same quiet warmth she had seen before, but there was something more now: respect, patience, understanding. "You came," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I did," he replied gently. "I waited because I knew you'd need to decide for yourself." Clara swallowed the lump in her throat, making words clumsy. I thought I had to do everything alone. That asking for help, it would make me less." He shook his head slowly. "Asking for help doesn't make you less. It makes you human. It takes courage to recognize that even the strongest need support sometimes." Her eyes fell to her hands, trembling slightly. She pictured her daughter's smile, the little hands that had held hers so tightly on nights she had felt most alone. Couldn't she show that same courage for her, too? Couldn't she allow herself to receive without guilt, without fear? "I want to accept," Clara said finally, her voice firmer now. "But I need to do it on my own terms. Not as a charity case. Not as someone who owes. I want to do it because it's right, because I can." He nodded, and something in the room seemed to settle. The tension that had clung to her shoulders for years loosened, just slightly, like the first deep exhale after a long-held breath. "You can," he said softly, "and I'll respect your boundaries. Always. That's part of kindness, too, giving, but never overstepping." Clara's chest swelled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the weight of the world pressing down. She felt lighter, not because her burdens had vanished, but because she had allowed herself to acknowledge that she didn't have to bear them alone. They sat together in silence, the quiet punctuated only by the soft hum of life outside the window. And in that silence, Clara realized something profound. Dignity and gratitude were not opposites. They could coexist, fragile and resilient, like sunlight through a stained glass window, broken into pieces, but still warm and whole. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. She had chosen bravery in the form of acceptance. She had chosen herself, her daughter, and the life that had always demanded she keep moving forward. And as the morning light spilled across the room, Clara understood that she could carry both strength and vulnerability together. That receiving could be as courageous as giving. That even in letting go of pride, she had not lost herself. She looked at him and smiled, a quiet, steady smile, and in that smile was everything: acknowledgement, relief, hope, and the unspoken promise that her heart, finally, could breathe. Because today, she realized, accepting help was not surrender. It was life. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, soft and deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. Clara watched it from her new apartment window, the city below waking slowly, unhurried. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of stability she hadn't thought possible. Walls she could trust, a floor she could walk without fear, a future she could envision. Her daughter sat at the small kitchen table, a sketchpad open, pencils scattered around her like tiny promises. She was humming a tune Clara hadn't heard her sing in months, a song of hope that seemed to spill from every corner of the room. Clara's hand hovered over her daughter's hair, brushing a loose strand behind her ear. The small acts of care, the routines she had almost forgotten, now felt sacred. Each moment in this safe space, each laugh, each quiet breath of normalcy, was proof that they had survived. And not just survived, they were beginning to thrive. Across town, the man she had once fed was taking steps of his own. His public life, fractured and neglected, was being rebuilt piece by piece. Meetings that had once felt like a mountain were now small hills, traversed with careful intention. He walked into rooms that had once been silent to him and found that his voice mattered, that people still remembered the man behind the fall. Yet, in his quiet moments, it was Clara's face that lingered, the woman who had offered him sustenance when there was nothing else to hold on to. He thought about her not in guilt or obligation, but in gratitude and in awe of the courage she had shown. Every day he reminded himself that her kindness had been the hinge that shifted the axis of his life, and he vowed never to take that for granted. Clara herself had begun to reclaim her own narrative. No longer just the shadow behind acts of mercy. She stepped into her life with intention. Her apartment was modest, but every corner reflected her choices. Soft blankets for her daughter, books she had wanted to read for years, a small window garden she tended with meticulous care. Even her daughter's future was opening in ways Clara had scarcely dared to imagine. School applications, scholarship possibilities, programs that promised opportunities once thought unattainable. Clara mapped them carefully, each choice a seed of hope planted for the child who had always been her anchor. She realized that by accepting kindness herself, she had expanded the circle of possibility. One evening, they met again, the man and Clara, in a quiet cafe where the chairs were old but comfortable, and the smell of coffee wrapped around them like a familiar blanket. There were no grand gestures, no dramatics. Just two people who had survived, who had been transformed by the simplest of acts. The choice to give when giving seemed impossible. "It's strange," he said, stirring his coffee absently. "To think that a single act, one small kindness, could redirect so much." Clara smiled softly, her gaze on her daughter's future, on the life she was building. "It is strange. And yet, it's true. One moment, one choice, it can change everything." He nodded. "I suppose we're both proof of that." "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "And we carry it forward. Not as debt, not as guilt, but as life." For a while, they sat in quiet reflection. No words could add to what had already been done. No action could amplify the courage that had carried them here. And yet, in that silence, there was peace, a recognition that their lives, once fractured, were now being stitched together with threads of hope, patience, and intention. Later, as Clara walked home with her daughter, the city lights flickering in the gathering dusk, she thought about how fragile and resilient life was, how quickly fortunes could turn when someone extended mercy, even in the smallest way. She realized that rebuilding wasn't just about walls and schedules and plans. It was about seeing value in oneself and seeing value in the lives around her. Her daughter's laughter echoed down the street, light and untethered. Clara caught herself smiling, feeling a quiet warmth that radiated from the inside out. The future was still unwritten, still tentative, but it was theirs to hold. And that realization, that small yet profound truth, made every hardship they had endured worthwhile. And in the quiet of her own heart, Clara knew that the act that had started it all, simple, brave, and unassuming, would never be forgotten. A meal, a moment of attention, a hand extended when the world had turned its back. It had done more than feed a body. It had rebuilt lives, restored faith, and opened doors that once seemed forever closed. As she closed the apartment door behind her that night, she took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Life was fragile, but it was also miraculous. And for the first time in a long while, she felt whole. The smallest mercy can redraw entire destinies. Clara's mornings had begun to carry a quiet rhythm of purpose. The soft hum of the city outside her window was no longer overwhelming. It was familiar, almost comforting. She rose early, brewed tea for herself and her daughter, and began the small acts that had once seemed insignificant, checking on neighbors, offering a meal to someone in need, a warm word to a stranger whose eyes were tired. Each gesture felt like a ripple in a pond, subtle yet persistent. She didn't expect acknowledgement. She didn't expect change. She only moved because she could not walk past suffering, because the memory of the man she had once fed refused to let her look away from anyone in pain. And yet, she began to see results. Not grand, not dramatic, but tangible. A neighbor smiled more freely. A young woman at the corner shop thanked her with more than politeness. There was a glimmer of relief in her eyes. The small acts, she realized, were accumulating. Each one was a quiet insistence that life, even when harsh, could be met with softness. The man stayed in touch, not intrusively, not out of obligation, but with the ease of someone who understood that their lives were forever connected, though separate. His messages were often brief. Updates about his progress, a thoughtful question, or an observation that made her smile. Sometimes they met in cafes or parks, sitting in companionable silence, reflecting on the ways their lives had shifted, shaped by the smallest of choices. "You know," he said once over coffee, stirring it absent-mindedly, "the kindness you showed me didn't just save my life. It changed how I see the world. I try to pass it forward, too." Clara smiled, thinking of the quiet victories she had witnessed since. "I think kindness multiplies," she said. "You give it, and it returns in ways you never expect. Sometimes it comes back to you. Sometimes it grows in ways you never see." He nodded. "It's like we're both part of the same chain now. Even if we're apart, our actions echo in each other's lives." She thought about her daughter, about the hope she could now cultivate for her future, the stability that allowed dreams to breathe. She thought about the neighbors who had received small comforts, the strangers whose days had been brightened by her attention. She understood, with a clarity that filled her chest, that compassion didn't just change people, it changed systems. It was a network of humanity, fragile and persistent, fueled by decisions as small as a meal, a word, a hand extended when no one else could. And she had been part of the beginning. One afternoon, as Clara walked her daughter home from school, a young boy dropped his books in front of them. Clara bent to help him gather them, laughing softly when he muttered a shy, "Thank you." Her daughter smiled too, mirroring her mother's warmth. That simple exchange, the passing of a quiet grace, felt profound. Clara realized that kindness was not about heroics. It wasn't about recognition or repayment. It was about the courage to respond when the world presented suffering, the willingness to meet need with presence and care. And in that courage, lives were rebuilt, hearts were healed, and hope was multiplied. That evening, she received a note from him, short but unmistakably heartfelt. "Seeing how you continue to give, how you refuse to look away, reminds me of the better world we can create. Thank you. For yourself, for others, for showing that mercy matters." Clara folded the note carefully and placed it in her journal. She closed her eyes and let herself feel the fullness of it. She understood now that life was not measured only in the crises that survived or the losses endured, but in the moments of compassion, in the choices that shifted lives quietly and irreversibly. Her daughter's laughter echoed from the living room, a sound so light and pure that Clara could feel it in her bones. The apartment, the city, the world, it all felt a little brighter, a little safer, because someone had dared to care. She thought of the man, of the lives that had touched hers, of the possibilities that now extended beyond what she could see. In a world often cruel and indifferent, she realized that hope was not passive. Hope was active. Hope was in action, in the smallest gestures that demanded courage. And as she sat there, journaling the events of the day, Clara felt an ease she hadn't known in years, a deep, earned, quiet joy. She was part of a continuum of kindness, a thread in a vast fabric of mercy and care that wove lives together, reshaped destinies, and left traces of hope in unexpected places. Her daughter peeked around the doorway, eyes bright, hair tousled from play. "Mom," she said, "we helped someone today." Clara's heart swelled. "Yes, we did," she said, smiling, understanding that the smallest acts, when done with courage, multiplied far beyond the moment. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of gold and amber, and Clara allowed herself one final reflection before closing the day. She had been brave. She had acted. She had chosen to see, to give, to risk, and in doing so, the world had responded. The lives of one man, one child, countless strangers, had been altered by her courage to act. And in the quiet of her heart, she understood the truth she had carried all along. She fed him because she couldn't walk past suffering. And in that choice, she discovered that even the smallest act of kindness can change the course of many lives.